It is my pleasure to introduce Emma Riley. Emma was the full-time hawk counter and daily on-site coordinator during the 10-week spring 2022 season of DFO's Hawk Watch program. She has accepted the 2023 position as well, and we are thrilled. Tonight, she will speak about National Hawk Watch efforts, where they are and why they matter, and present an update on the results and trends from this year's season at Dinosaur Ridge. Emma is a raptor biologist and naturalist with a degree in wildlife biology from Colorado State University. Since graduating, she has worked with ferruginous hawks in Wyoming and breeding passerines across Wyoming and Idaho. In fall 2021, she worked at Hawk Ridge Bird Observatory in Duluth, Minnesota. This fall, she has been trapping and counting Swainson's hawks and other southbound migrants in New Mexico, stationed at Hawk Watch International's Manzanos Mountains Migration Site, southeast of Albuquerque. Raptor biology is Emma's passion, especially migration and movement ecology. One of her spark birds is ferruginous hawk, and Dinosaur Ridge is considered the best place in America to see migrating ferruges in spring. When not birding, Emma enjoys snowboarding, mountain biking, and hanging out with her dog and 2 cats in Fort Collins, either at home or at a local microbrewery. Ladies and gentlemen, I present you with Emma Riley.
Thanks so much, Dave. That was so sweet of you. I want to start off and have my sincerest apologies. I was fully anticipating my camera to be functioning tonight, but it is not. So I just wanted to go ahead and apologize for that. Got all nice and dolled up for you all tonight, and unfortunately, you're not able to see my face, but it is nice to see you guys all. And again, thank you so much for having me. I am super excited to come and talk about Hawk Watch and Dinosaur Ridge. As Dave said, Dinosaur Ridge is one of the best spots in the world, or is the best spot in the world to see migrating ferruginous hawks. And it really has become one of my favorite spots for hawk watching. Like Dave said, I've worked at a couple different hawk watches at this point, and Dinosaur Ridge really is near and dear to my heart. So I'm really excited to be here. So let me go ahead and get my presentation up and get going. And I will say, yes, totally questions at the end. I don't believe that I am going to be able to see the Q&A portion on the Zoom screen while I'm giving this presentation. So please be patient with me. I will totally give my greatest efforts to answer all of your questions at the end of the presentation. So let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay. I just want to double check. Are you all able to see that?
Yes.
Perfect. All right. Let me go back one. Oh my gosh. And I'm already, there we go. Perfect. So like Dave said, my name is Emma Riley. I got my bachelor's degree in the full official title is Fish, Wildlife, and Conservation Biology from Colorado State University. I graduated at the end of 2020 with a couple extra years under my belt in college while I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do. And like Dave said, I found ferruginous hawks through a teaching assistant for one of my ornithology classes in college, and became absolutely head over heels obsessed. After that, I got into hawk watching a little bit, and now I am fully obsessed with hawk watching, and I'm super excited to be coming back this next spring. So as I begin, I just wanted to go ahead and kind of kick off and discuss some migration ecology. We're talking about a migration site for raptors, and I think it's really important to answer some of those questions about migration before we get into some more of the logistics. So to begin, understanding why raptors are migrating, there are so many different aspects to it, but it all really boils down to food supplies. So whether it's, over the winter, usually it's over the winter, the food supplies are going to be scarce in those original breeding habitats. Some prey are going into torpor, which is kind of a partial hibernation or full hibernation. And either way, predators are having to adjust their eating habits. So some predators in the mammal world, like bears and moose, will eat tree bark in the middle of the winter. Raptors don't necessarily have that option, so they have to move. And when they are moving, as we see, Dinosaur Ridge is a spring site. So they are moving at fall and at spring. And the understanding of why these birds are moving then has been highly debated in the ornithology world between biologists, but it is fully agreed upon that it is an innate and not a learned behavior. We can tell that it's an innate behavior, so something that they are born knowing, because most of the young raptors that we see, when they are taking their first migration, they are not flying with their adult counterparts. So there is something within them knowing that they need to go. And what that is what is being highly debated between ornithologists. All of the kind of aspects point towards two main concepts, which is photo period or time of day or weather, so temperature, that kind of a thing. But yeah, it's definitely an interesting conversation that ornithologists are still having. But we know that it's innate, and we know that, each fall and spring for hundreds and thousands of years, these birds have been taking these migratory routes. And then where these migratory routes are, I've got a map nice over to the left of the main migration routes that both raptors as well as passerines or songbirds and waterfowl will take on their migratory routes through North America. So all of these routes that we are seeing are either along a coastline or a major mountain range. So those ridge lines, like we have at Dinosaur Ridge, are really crucial in the paths that they take. Ridge lines, if you've been up to the Hawk Watch with me at all this spring, I talk a lot about the thermal lift and how it's looking that day. So ridge lines, when the winds are hitting the ridges, they create this nice thermal updraft, as well as when the sun is heating the ground. So those two, both the sun as well as the geography and the topography of the areas, these ridge lines make for really easy migratory paths. So that lift can rise, can help raptors raise about 7 miles or 1 mile into the sky. And once they get that 1 mile height, they can glide about 7 miles. So these migratory pathways really optimize the energy usage that they have to have, or that they require to make these really long journeys. And then, like I said, we've got ridge lines in Dinosaur Ridge, but there are so many other hawk watches all across North America and the world, and a lot of them you can find along waterways. So, we've got the Pacific as well as the Atlantic coast that have some great hawk watches. The Atlantic coast, especially out east, has a huge concentration of hawk watches. And those coasts act as really nice pathways, and they also act as really nice barriers. So there's kind of a twofold going on with those guys. Raptors generally do not want to cross big bodies of water. So even the Great Lakes, you can kind of see in that Mississippi line that it looks like they're going right across it, but they're not, they're going around it. So Hawk Ridge Bird Observatory in Duluth, which is a spot that I did work at, we tend to get a lot of those birds coming down directly north, south, down to Lake Superior, and then going east or west to go around those bodies of water. The Mississippi River also acts as a great pathway. It's a nice north-south line, and a lot of times those water spots, they come with a lot of foliage, a lot of tree cover, and that acts as really nice resting spots for these birds when they're having to take those huge journeys that they take twice a year. So that is just kind of the brief overview that I wanted to give on migration ecology, and we will get into some history. So I started to go into the history of hawk watching and realized that I needed to give a little bit more of a comprehensive idea of what was going on at the time when hawk watching began. So I'm going to take it all the way back to the 1800s and even before then, in the 16th and 17th century, which I'm sure, if you're here, you have a passion for avian conservation and you might know some of this history. So I apologize if I'm repeating myself. I just think it's really important to get that comprehensive overview. So 16th, 17th century in Europe, high wealth women were finding hats with feathers, and it became a huge market. And the rarer the bird and the rarer the feather that was in your hat meant your higher status. That's not to say that only rare birds were targeted for this, what we call market hunting. Most bird species, if they had any sort of bright plumage to them, were being hunted. And at the same time, so this was happening 16th, 17th century in Europe. By the 1800s, this trend was brought over to North America. So about mid 1800s, there's a couple New York Times or some articles that discuss the prevalence of these feather hats and this market becoming a huge market in North America. And at the same time, raptors are being hunted for sport. And like I spoke about in the previous slide, there are these great migratory pathways, and the first people to discover those were hunters. So a lot of these birds and a lot of these spots were used for target practice, and I will get way into that in a little bit, but just to give an idea of where we're kind of starting from. So in the 1800s, once this trend was brought over, at the same time, we're starting to see some species declines and extinctions. So in Europe, by the end of the 1800s, we were already having some species go extinct due to these practices, and then well into the early 1900s, in North America, we're able to really see those impacts in those species. And then, yeah, by the end of the 1800s, the first Audubon organizations were established in both North America and Europe. And the species declines from these hat markets are really a huge player in why avian conservation was started. So then in 1900, we have our first ever piece of legislation in North America or in the United States that's targeted towards wildlife conservation. And that's the Lacey Act. So the Lacey Act prohibits the trade of hunted animals across state lines. So there is no protection. They're not actually saying you cannot kill this ABC animal. They're, preventing from, they're trying to prohibit and prevent the amount of market that is being supplied from this hunting. But, as I said, this isn't preventing any of the hunting. They're not stopping, they're not making regulations as you can't hunt. They're just trying to decrease and do their best to limit the species declines. And then in 1913, we see our first Migratory Bird Act. So this is the first piece of legislation that's actually put into play that's targeted towards birds. And this was targeted towards game and insectivorous birds. So most of our passerines, and then game is waterfowl and quail and those sort. And they were trying to totally eliminate the spring shooting of these birds. So when they're on their migration, they were totally trying to prohibit it. Unfortunately, that was deemed unconstitutional by two different courts a couple years after passing. So that actually was not able to be enforced or enacted. And then in 1916, we get the Migratory Bird Treaty between US and Canada, but it says Great Britain because Canada was still under Great Britain's reign. But the Migratory Bird Treaty was to stop hunting of insectivorous and regulate game bird hunting between Canada and the US. So this is the first piece of legislation that acknowledges migration and is trying to protect those birds that are making those great journeys. But this is still leaving out raptors. So we've got game birds and we've got insectivorous birds with some amount of protection, definitely not a large amount of protection, but some protection. And this act or this treaty is truly targeted to protect beneficial or harmless birds. So, any beneficial in terms of a market, in terms of sustenance, or harmless birds, aka not pest birds. And for a really long time, raptors were seen as pest birds. So they did not, unfortunately, make the cut, if you will, for this treaty. But luckily, 2 years later, we get the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. So this is our true and tried Bird Protection Act. It's still in act today, and it is one of the largest pieces of legislation that protects raptors as well as all other birds we've got in North America. So this act deems it unlawful to pursue, hunt, take, capture, kill, or sell any migratory native bird. And this is huge. But unfortunately, at this time, 1918, getting into the 20s and the 30s, we've got a little bit of war kicking up. So unfortunately, as we'll talk about in a little bit, the enforcement of it did not get carried through the way that it was intended to. And then going on 1936, so this is right before World War II starts, the US signs a very similar treaty that they signed with Canada, with Mexico. And then just a couple more bits of history. 1940, we get the Bald Eagle Protection Act, which prohibits any taking of parts, including feathers, of bald eagles. And then later, I believe in the 70s or 80s, the golden eagles were added. If that is a wrong date, please let me know. And then, yeah, continuing the 1970s is when we finally get corporations and private companies added to the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. So this is when they're recognizing that industries can also impact bird populations, well, whether it's a population level or individual level. And this is when they're finally getting, finally being held accountable for that, which is fantastic. And then also in the 70s, we see treaties signed with Japan as well as Russia on migratory birds, because we do have quite a number of species that will migrate between Russia's and North America. And as some of you may know, some that migrate on accident, like the Steller sea eagle that we've been seeing around in the East Coast. And then the last piece of history is 1973, the Endangered Species Act. So with this act in place, 1973 is truly the first year that we can say that we've got all native, non-invasive bird species protected. So between the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, the Bald Eagle Protection Act, and the Endangered Species Act, we are finally at some legislation. So that is fantastic. So that's just a little bit of the political and the legislative history on avian conservation, which I think is really important to go over. So then we will get into hawk watching. Hello, there we go. So our first ever hawk watch in North America is Hawk Mountain Sanctuary in Pennsylvania. And this is a pretty fun story. I really like it. So I'll go ahead and tell you now. In 1932, a man named Richard Pugh, which actually ended up being the first president of Nature Conservancy in 1956. He also has many books authored on illustrations of North American birds. Definitely recommend checking them out. He is a huge player in avian conservation. But he hears of one of those local hunts that I was talking about at Hawk Mountain. So many springs all over the country, hunters would join to have an annual hunt. And this is not just at Hawk Mountain, this is all over the country. And around the 30s, well into the 70s or 50s, I'd say, people are noticing this and they're getting angry. So Richard Pugh is one of those people that first noticed that this hunt is happening at Hawk Mountain. And he goes to the local Audubon group and lobbies them. And Audubon agrees. They say that they will raise the funds, they will try and protect the land, and they will do what they can to stop this from happening. Shortly after, next year, they don't follow through with that, unfortunately. And a woman by the name of Rosalie Edge gets wind of this. So she hears, that Richard Pugh found out about this hunt, and that Audubon agreed, and she was just not happy with them not following through. So she decided to take matters into her own hands. So in 1934, she signed a $500 lease for about 1,300 acres, which is now the Hawk Mountain Sanctuary. And she did not have the money to be able to afford that when she signed the lease. She was just passionate and knew what she wanted to do. And she managed to raise the funds, and they started hiring wardens to manage the hunters. And that year they started counting the migration. I will be very honest. It is a little bit tricky to find some of this history on the internet. I would love to have access to some books to be able to go through. But according to Wikipedia, take it with a grain of salt, Hawk Mountain Sanctuary is the first protected reserve for birds of prey in the world, which is really incredible. So 1934, that's about 16 years after the Migratory Bird Treaty Act is in play. This hunt is still happening. So like I said earlier, the enforcement of these acts was unfortunately not high for many years, and that is why conservation groups had to take things into their own hands. But yeah, in 1934, Hawk Mountain starts counting, and you can still go to hawkcount.org and see the first year that they had data, and they counted almost 8,000 birds that season, which I think is really exciting. And then, of course, in Hawk Count, you will see a lag in data or a missing data for some years, and that is due to World War II. So really interesting to put all of this into perspective of, the history of the country. So 1934, we get our first hawk watch. And then we get a number following. So I'm going to go over just a couple, just to kind of get an idea of, how things followed after that. So we'll start with Cape May. Cape May is also a very notable hawk watch in the country. Again, in 1930, so actually before Richard Pugh went to the hunt. In 1931, wardens were hired to protect only certain species. So there were some species that were protected under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act and some that weren't. And again, this was a piece of information that was really tough for me to find. So if anyone has any resources on, which birds were originally protected, I would love to find that and be able to provide that information with you all. But I did have a source tell me that in 1931, when they hired these wardens, the hunters were still allowed to shoot and kill sharp-shinned hawks, Cooper's hawks, and this is just wild to me, peregrine falcons. So those three species were not protected, but other species that were migrating through were protected by these wardens that were hired privately. And then it took, 30, 35 years for anyone to actually start counting. They had an intermittent count in 1965, as well as in 1970. And then in between those years, 1967, a man named Bill Clark is looking for a place to trap raptors. And a local friend tells him, you've got to check out Cape May. The birds there are nuts. And so he decides he wants to set up his trapping station there. And he goes through all of the processes to get permits and get started and get set up. And by 1976, he finally has the funds to hire an official counter. And that official counter is Pete Dunn, who is also another very notable hawk watcher. And I thought that this was an interesting fact. He was paid $500 for the season. And he wrote an article about the history of Cape May. And he says that, of course, he was going to accept $500. There was no one else offering to pay to count hawks, which I think is just a little fun piece of information. So yeah, Cape May, you can, the land and the birds got some protections in 1931, but it wasn't until 1976 where they started really standardizing that count. Another notable hawk watch that is, an early starter is Hawk Ridge Bird Observatory in Duluth, Minnesota. I had the privilege of working there last fall and it's the same story, which is really a bummer. But there were people that realized the raptors were migrating through, and they were hunting them out of the sky. A lot of times they were using them as target practice, and sometimes they were even getting paid. I know in 1929, the Pennsylvania Game Division was offering $5 per goshawk. So this is not only, people aren't only turning an eye, they're encouraging this after the Migratory Bird Treaty Act is enacted, which I think is incredible, to say the least. And like I said, I'd love to know more about how that kind of happened. But yeah, so 1951, 1950, the Duluth Birding Club, which is now Duluth Audubon, found out about the hunt, and they went up to the ridge and physically were protesting the hunt and managed to get Duluth to get behind them. In 1951, they started counting. In 1972, they started standardizing their count data. So getting weather data, having a database that they're entering it into, and they started trapping that year as well. They do have hawk count data starting in 1971. So when I reference hawk count data, that is the overarching database. And I have a link to it at the end of the presentation that we enter our data into, as well as most other hawk watches. So that's where you can find a lot of this historical data. But their data starts in 1971. And I thought this was really interesting. The man that was counting that year is Frank Nicoletti, who is now the active trapping director at Hawk Ridge. So he has been there for as long as Hawk Ridge has been doing their standardized count, which I think is fantastic, and he's a great guy to learn from. Another notable, and this will be brief, station is Cedar Grove Ornithological Research Station. They counted intermittently in the 30s, and then they started counting and trapping consistently in 1950. But this station isn't open to visitors, which I think is pretty rare in terms of hawk watches. But it seems like it's kind of a hard to reach spot, but they are still counting and trapping today. And they also offer a trapping and banding internship every fall, which I think is a fun opportunity. And then moving west, I just wanted to include this one, the Wellsville Mountains in in Utah. So the Wellsville Mountains were founded by Steve Hoffman and Wayne Potts in 1976. So, we've got the Eastern and the Midwest sites going in the 30s into the 50s. But it isn't until 1976 that the first hawk watch west of the Mississippi is founded. And that's founded by Steve Hoffman and Wayne Potts. Steve Hoffman then goes on to find Hawkwatch International. And it's the first Western Hawkwatch site, which is fantastic. So at that point, there were dozens of Hawkwatch sites in the East, but the West was really lacking. And he decided he wanted to bring it west. So that brings me to Dinosaur Ridge. So, like I said, Steve Hoffman founded Hawkwatch International in 1976. Hawkwatch International manages, 6 or 7 active count sites in the fall, and then they manage 1 active spring site today. And I was actually working at one of their sites this fall. But they decided that they wanted to continue their search for Western Hawkwatch sites, and they contracted out a number of individuals all over the West to try and find those sites. And one of those individuals was a man named Dwayne Nelson. And so he was assigned to go explore the foothills, and Dwayne Nelson at the time was a volunteer for what we now know as Bird Conservancy of the Rockies. So I, for the rest of the presentation, abbreviate that to BCR. They have had a couple different names. They first started out as Colorado Bird Observatory. So that was the name that they were operating under when Dwayne Nelson was present. And then they changed their name to Rocky Mountain Bird Observatory, and now they're Bird Conservancy of the Rockies. So a couple names there, but I just wanted to streamline that. So I'll refer to them as Bird Conservancy of the Rockies now. So he was volunteering for them, but also contracted out by Hawkwatch. And on March 30th, 1990, he discovered what's now the Dinosaur Ridge site. He brings it back to Hawkwatch International. They do some, exploratory counts, and then they decide that they're not going to fund it because the numbers are too low. And mind you, at this point, we're still really low on Western Hawkwatch sites. And so what we know is the Eastern Hawkwatch sites. And a lot of those sites have massive, massive numbers, high volume. And so coming out West and having those a little bit lower numbers that aren't, necessarily as exciting to see on paper, they decided against it, which is their loss because now we're here. So Dwayne decided between the spring of 1990 and the spring of 1991, he decided to show the site to his boss, the then director of Bird Conservancy of the Rockies, Mike Carter, and the chair of zoology for the Denver Museum of Natural History, which is now known as the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, and that's Chuck Preston. So those 3 men found the site, and they decided that they wanted to start what they called the Dinosaur Ridge Raptor Migration Station, or what they called DREAMS, which I think is really sweet. So 1991, they kick it off the ground and they start looking for help. They managed to partner with Jefferson County Open Space to get the trail that we now use. At that time, when they first founded the site, the trail was little to nothing. And so Jeffco came in and helped us build up that trail. And in that time, Chuck Preston also helped kind of flatten out the platform that we use now. So they managed to get, they got the help of Jefferson County Open Space. And then they also had a couple other men that I've got their names here and wanted to mention. Frank Hine was working under Chuck Preston at the museum at the time. And Tony Lukrang was working under Mike Carter at the time for BCR. And all 4 of those men had huge impacts and really helped manage and run the station. So in those early years, they trained over 35 volunteers to standardize the count. And they were really having some impressive media coverage. They had an NPR article, NPR interview. They had a couple articles posted. So it was really kicking off. And then about 1998, both Mike and Chuck leave their positions with BCR and the museum. And unfortunately, this kind of ends for a couple of years, the interest and the funding for the site. So we actually don't have count data between 1998 and 2000 because we didn't have funding for it. So come 2001, Bird Conservancy of the Rockies decides to step back in. This is another piece of history that if anyone has an extra, any bits of information that I'm missing, I would love to know that. So feel free to mention that at the end. But it is my understanding that in the early 2000s, the museum was still kind of giving funding. And then that managed to fall out eventually and kind of dwindle out. And then by 2009, a man who is still at Dinosaur Ridge, and I know personally he's a great guy, Jeff Bierich, started to work for Bird Conservancy of the Rockies and took over the Dinosaur Ridge site. So from 2009 to 2016, he trained many volunteers and got the volunteer program really up and running and kind of getting it back to where it was after we had that kind of lapse in funding and the lapse in monitoring of the station. And then Jeff left BCR in 2016, and then Matt Smith kind of took over for Bird Conservancy of the Rockies until 2020. The last spring that they counted was 2019, and then 2020 we took it over. So that is where we come in. So Denver field ornithologists managed to snag the site, which I think is a great steal. And we are here now. So in the last couple of years, as I'm sure many of you know and are involved with, we've had volunteers running the site, which has been an incredible experience. Getting to have so many different people involved in the site has been fantastic. And it also comes with some challenges. And I think that a lot of hawk watches across the country recognize this, that, you're missing a little bit of the streamlining than when you have one or two or a couple people working. And so Denver field ornithologists decided to hire on a full-time counter in 2022, this past spring. And that was me. And I loved it. So that is a little bit of the history on Dinosaur Ridge. We've had quite a number of different managing partners and players involved. But I am, super happy that we're here where we are now and I'm able to give you guys this presentation tonight. So moving on, I wanted to give you a map of all of the hawk watches we've got now actively. So this map is provided from Humana, which is the Hawk Migration Association of North America. So each hawk watch that's listed on this map is an active member that is actively contributing to the data set, which I will get into in just a second. So this is definitely not all of the hawk watches that are manned, either in fall or spring throughout the country. This is just a subset of them that are manned consistently enough to be able to provide the data that we need. So the actual Humana website lists over 300 Hawkwatch sites, and on this map there's 76 noted. So it's a huge difference, but most of those Hawkwatches are out east. Even looking at this map, you can really see that high concentration out east. In the Western United States, we've got eight Hawkwatches, and we are one of them, and we are the only Hawkwatch that has ever operated in Colorado, which is pretty incredible. So I'm going to move on. And then I, of course, am not allowed to give a hawk watching presentation without mentioning Jerry Liguori. So Jerry Liguori is arguably the most notable hawk watcher in history. I would not be surprised if many of you have heard this name. He also has been involved in Dinosaur Ridge in the past, as well as other hawk watches all over the country, but in the West as well. And so if you've had the chance to meet him, I have heard incredible stories about him. But he started off in New Jersey, where he's from, as a hawk watcher. And I listened to a podcast that he had with the American Birding Podcast, which is hosted by the ABA, a couple days ago. And he admits that he got into raptors when he was 17, which I think is super cool. I didn't find them until my 20s. But yeah, he first saw a turkey vulture when he was 17 years old and was mesmerized by the way that they were able to just stay afloat and not have to flap that much. And that kicked off a 30-year career as a raptor researcher and biologist. He counted in Cape May. He worked all over the East. And then in 2012, he joined Hawkwatch International as an educator. And he really wanted to provide information and provide expertise to all levels of hawk watchers and what birds truly look like in the field. Because I'm sure, as many of you know, if you have ever looked at a picture of a red-tailed hawk sitting on a post, it is so hard to try and translate that into in flight. And I also am sure many of you have seen the books that I've got pictures of on the right. So he has published more than 2 books, but these are two of the main guys, Hawks at a Distance and Hawks from Every Angle. And most, if not all of those photos in those books, he took. So he went to migration sites every fall as well as spring, and was taking hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of photos to be able to provide this education and this information to the public as well as to other hawk watchers. And he's got a couple different awards that I think he's more than deserving of. So in 2019, he got the Hawkwatch International Lifetime Achievement Award. In 2017, he got the American Birding Association Robert Ridgway Award, which is an award for publishing literature. So he has been a huge impact on the Hawkwatch community and information and the knowledge that we have and I have personally. And I recently found this out, and I could not be more excited that he's counted a season at Dinosaur Ridge. And he counted, it is believed to be 1997. We recently have uncovered a whole chunk of data from 1991 until 1998 that we have never had access to before. And hopefully it will be in our database here soon, and we'll be able to research it and kind of look into it and see where his name is. But rumor has it was 1997, and that was actually the year that we got both our season and our daily record for ferruginous hawks, which is just, I feel like classic Jerry LaGuarre. And then this is just a really nice quote that I got from the podcast I was listening to the other day, but they were asking him about, going to a hawk watch now and how he feels. And he said, I love it more today than I ever have. And I just think that's beautiful. So that is a little bit about Jerry LaGuarre, and then I will move on. Great. So why do we care? We've got people like Jerry LaGuarre, people like Dwayne Nelson, people like Robert Pugh and Rosalie Edge, spending hundreds of hours and information and dedicating their lives to these monitoring stations. And there's funding in it. And if you look at, maybe recreational bird watching and why there's not, comparing the two and looking into why there's funding in this long-term monitoring of raptors, is what I'm going to go over now. So one main thing, especially with running these long-term sites, is the annual variation that we see in year to year. So year to year birds can do really weird things. You can have a great year one year and have a really weird year the next year, and that does not tell us how the population is doing. Many bird species have cyclical patterns in their population trends. So every 5, 10, 15 years, they'll have a peak, and then they'll decline, and then they'll come back up. And then there's other species that are super dependent on prey availability. So one of those examples is the snowy owl. Snowy owls, we often can see them in the lower 48 when the vole availability in the Arctic is diminished. And so, every year you can see different things. It can be really weird, and we need to be able to look at a long-term data set and being able to analyze those population trends to really get an understanding of what's going on. So once we have those understandings, the next really crucial part, if not the most important part, is being able to present those findings to biologists and other conservationists. So once we're able to look at those population trends, see how things are doing over 10, 20 years, we can then make recommendations to conservationists, and we see that in play all the time. So we've got, plenty of nest box programs for American kestrels and saw-whets and barn owls. We have platforms that are being built for osprey reproduction, as well as, which I think is super cool, ferruginous hawk reproduction, and then the whole, I did not want to get into it because it could be a whole nother presentation, but the whole DDT issue in the Western Hemisphere, because it wasn't just North America, South America as well, and how conservationists were able to kind of combat that. So just some quick examples of how this data has really impacted conservation and the birds on the ground. And then also something that I think is almost equally as important is providing public with accurate information. One really huge role of scientists is to provide the public with information that they need to, care about things, make the decision if they want to care. And I think as scientists, it's our responsibility to be able to provide that information. So I think these long-term monitoring projects are really important. And I am not the only one that thought that. And that is why in 1974, over 300 hawk watchers all across North America came together in Syracuse, New York, and decided to have a meeting and started the Hawk Migration Association of North America. So I've mentioned them a little bit today, but they are the overarching organization that compiles all of our data, presents findings. They are really a key player in hawk watches as a whole. And then in 2003, Hawk Migration Association of North America, as well as a couple other organizations, including Hawk Mountain in Pennsylvania and Hawkwatch International, decided to come together and realized that they needed a way to standardize the data analysis. So Hawk Migration Association was kind of started to standardize the data collection, to be able to have a database where we can put all of these birds in, all of these numbers in, and really understand what's going on, and just have that easily accessible. The Raptor Population Index Partnership came about so that we had a way of analyzing and being able to present those results in a streamlined way. And that partnership is still active today. Both of those organizations are still active today, and I find a lot of my data from them, and I will show you guys in just a couple minutes some of those examples of the graphs and the trends that they put together. But some of the things that they do is, and one of the most important ones is the Raptor Population Index. So the Raptor Population Index is a way to quantify changes in population over time with a digestible variable. So I'll go ahead and show you that in just a minute. But the Raptor Population Index is not showing you, in 1 year we had 10,000, the next year we had 12,000 birds. It's a quantifiable way to understand the changes in the populations without having to address those big numbers. So they do it in both graph form as well as map form. They also provide trend summary indexes, which is a -1 to 1 scale that population growth is measured on, and I'll show you that in a moment. And then a couple other things they do. So they run these indexes or run these analyses every 3 and as well as 10 years. And then based on the graphs and the quantitative data analysis that they do, they provide qualitative analysis as well. So those come in the species assessments, and then they also have a tab on their website that shows you raptors at risk / on the rise. And I think those are really great ways to get an understanding of what that data means, because even I, looking at the RPIs or the raptor population indexes initially, was getting kind of overwhelmed. So I'll go ahead and show you what some of these graphs look like. So this is one of the RPI trend maps. And I picked the American kestrel because, as some of you may know, the American kestrel is actually one species that is truly facing declines. And it is a species that we were able to notice those declines on long-term monitoring migration routes, which I think is just a great example of why these long-term sites are so important. Many ecologists have noted that they are not feeling like they are seeing less kestrels out in the field, but when we look at the migration data, we're seeing a pretty steep decline. So if we look at this map, there's a couple things going on. So we've got the blue dots as well as the green and red arrows, and that's looking at the migration data. And then the state colors are looking at the Christmas bird count data, which I think is really interesting. And I didn't realize that the Raptor Population Index partnership was using that data, but I think it's brilliant and definitely necessary and really cool to look at the overall picture. But you can see here on the East Coast, we're seeing some declines in both wintering data as well as migration data. Definitely still some stability, but the East is where we're seeing those main declines in the kestrel species. And then, yeah, again, if we look over out West, we also have some declines that we're seeing. In California, we're seeing a decline over the wintering grounds, so less birds are seeing there in the winter. And then in couple other those Western states, we've got a couple declines as well as some stability. So it's really interesting to be able to look at the population trends as a whole and look across the whole country, because as we know, there's always different things going on regionally, and the kestrel populations out here in the West are going to be totally different from what's happening in the East. So another reason why it's really important to kind of cover as much land as we can when we're doing these long-term monitoring projects. So that is just an example of the maps that they put together. And then this is an example of the trend summary indexes that they put together. So these are really interesting. It can be a little confusing, so I'll kind of walk you through. So on the left side of these graphs, we've got a range from -1 to 1, and that's looking at population growth. So if we've got a value below 0, that population has been declining. Above 0, that population has been increasing. At 0, we're staying stable. And then we've got two different graphs here. On the left, we've got the trend summary index from 1999 to 2019, so a full 20 years of data. And then on the right, we've got 10 years of data, so 2009 to 2019. And it's really interesting to kind of compare these graphs. I've kind of spent quite a bit of time looking at them, actually, because I think it's really interesting, and some of the differences that I wanted to point out. So if we look at the left graph, and all of these graphs are using bird codes, which are 4-letter codes using the first 2 letters of the first word in the name and the first letters in the second word of the name. I'm sorry if that was a little bit confusing. But so, for example, we've got PFA, which is peregrine falcon. So on the left side, in that 20-year analysis, we're seeing peregrine falcons at a 0.5 growth, which is huge growth, fantastic growth over a 20-year period. And then if we come over to the right graph, we can see that peregrine falcons, PFA, are staying stable in the last 10 years. So, we can get a really good look at what not only is happening recently, but also kind of over a longer period of time. And of course, this will be super interesting to see as decades go on and we continue to gather this data and see how these populations are doing. But yeah, I just thought that was one really interesting, difference. You can also see MERL, MERL, is showing the same pattern, not as intense or not as much growth as the peregrine falcons over the last 20 years, but definitely still seeing a difference in the 20-year analysis versus the 10. And then another really interesting one is the prairie falcon. So prairie falcon is PRFA, PRFA. Where did you go? There we go. So on the left side of the graph, or on the left graph, we're seeing about a 0.2 decline in the species over the last 20 years. And then if you go over to the right graph, we're seeing a 0.3 increase in the species. I don't have a great explanation for why that is. I'm sure if I did a little bit more research, I could look into the species assessments that are provided by the RPI project's website. But just some of these, it's really interesting to look at how these populations are doing over 10 years versus 20. And then another thing that I wanted to note, a couple things, is the bald eagle doing great. Both on the left graph and the right graph, we're seeing that the bald eagle is having great increases. And I truly do believe that is a direct result of conservation actions that were taken after the discovery of DDT harming raptor species. So that's just, it's always nice to see a success story. And another thing that I found really interesting is if you look at the left graph and you look at the stability of bird species, so, those ones that are riding that middle line, on the left graph, in the last 20 years, we've got 3 birds that are staying stable. But then over the last 10 years, we've got, 9, 3, 6, 10 bird species that are staying stable. So, and then we're also seeing, if we're looking at the right graph versus the left graph, the species that we're seeing decline over a 20-year span versus the 10-year span, that decline isn't as intense. So all of this is telling me that, conservation actions are being taken, these birds protections are being enforced, and that we are totally heading in the right direction, which is great to see. Okay, so then what we are looking at here now is the actual RPI graph, so the raptor population indexes, and these can be found both on the Raptor Population Index Partnership website, as well as hawkcount.org, where we input our data every day. So I can go in and look at today's data, and then I also can generate one of these RPIs. And so as I was saying earlier, the RPI is a way to quantify change. So if you look at the left side of the graph, we're not looking at true population numbers, we're looking at a proportion. We've standardized this data. And so I wanted to bring up 3 interesting species. And if you take note, these RPIs, so they run the RPIs locally for each site. So these are from Hawk Mountain in Pennsylvania. I wanted to go ahead and grab these because that is the longest running site that we have. So this is going to give us the most accurate and just greatest idea of what these trends have been looking like. And as you can see, we've got our first year is 1934. So the first one we've got is the American kestrel. And as I said earlier, we have seen declines in these species, and we are totally seeing that here, right? So that, it makes a lot of sense. This nice growth is fantastic. And the goal of conservationists now is to try and get this line to pop back up. So there's a couple different things that people are working on and some theories that they're running and testing to see why the kestrels are suffering right now. And then I don't like to dwell too much on the negatives. I wanted to bring in some success stories here. So I've got the peregrine falcon as well as the bald eagle maps, or the RPIs to present. So the first one, we can see a really clean, really obvious decline in the peregrine falcon. I mean, this is truly a graphical representation of the species decline and return. So just really cool to be able to look at that and see that really nice line. And then the same with the bald eagles, and this is honestly really impressive and really incredible to see how high the populations have gotten in comparison. And most people that I've talked to, especially when I was working in the Midwest, everyone has something to say about how many bald eagles they're seeing now. And even driving in Denver, or just being in Colorado in general, anywhere, I feel like most people I talk to have made a comment about the increase in bald eagle presence. And I think that's fantastic. But yeah, just a really nice look at that. I mean, who doesn't love an upward graph when we're talking about bird populations? So wanted to give you an idea of what those RPIs look like. And like I said, these are from Hawk Mountain. And so these are going to be a really nice, accurate representation. This site has been, minus World War II, manned really consistently since 1934. And so this is, a really great example of a clean, nice, accurate graph. And then what I'm going to do next is show you some of our RPIs from Dinosaur Ridge. And these get a little interesting, I will be honest. So you can see here, I think the first year we've got in our database right now is 2001. Like I said earlier, we've got data dating back to 1991 that we'll have access to soon. So I'd be super excited to take a look at these graphs and the numbers and see what that looks like once we get that data. But as of right now, we're looking from 2001 to, I believe 2019 is the last year that's counted in these. And that goes for all of the graphs that we're looking at. But each and every one of these, regardless of the species, you've got turkey vulture, Swainson's hawks, and bald eagle. We're seeing this really funky dip kind of happening in the 2000s. And granted, we've got only data from the 2000s, but about 2010 to about 2015, 16, 17. And I'd say, even arguing that drop started maybe around 2005, 2004. And it's consistent. So, we're seeing it across all 3 of these species. If I were to pull up other RPIs, which I was, kind of browsing around, looking at all of them, see which ones would make nice visuals, most, if not all, have this dip. And so that presents a challenge because as we saw on the last slide, especially with the bald eagle graph is not, it doesn't look anything like Hawk Mountain's. And I found that really interesting, and I kind of wanted to understand why that was, why we're seeing this pattern in these graphs and what we can do about that. And I do want to note that, we are also seeing this nice increase in every single one of them. So, around, seriously, 2016, we're seeing that increase kind of come back up. And I would definitely take the stance, I'll confidently take the stance that this is due to, just a bigger presence in what we've been doing recently. So I want to kind of get into why we're seeing this overarching dip in our raptor population indexes from Dinosaur Ridge. Let me So actually, yeah, we'll take a second really quick. So this is just a chart of all of the fall totals that we've got, or all the spring totals that we've got on the database in Humana's database on hawk count. So if we take a look at the left or at the right side, we can see the total number of birds that were counted. 2022 was a fantastic year for us. We haven't had that many birds counted since 2005. And, we're seeing between 2005 and 2022, we're seeing this nice, lower numbers than we were seeing beforehand. I mean, 2002, we've got 3,400 birds. Oh man, sorry, there we go. We're seeing 3,400 birds. We're seeing this really nice decline. And as I said, populations are always doing something weird. And it is not unlikely that we just have low years, right? That is totally normal. Variation within these years is normal, expected, and hoped for. So first glance, that is not alarming. But I do want to take a look at this graph that I put together, which is looking at the birds per hour. So, over the last 19 years, am I doing my math right? Over the last couple decades that Dinosaur Ridge has been running, we have had quite a change in hands and change in organizations and change in manpower. And so when you go ahead and standardize the data, so what I did was I took all of the birds that we counted each year and divided it by the number of hours that were counted. So you can see here in this graph on the left side, we've got number of hours and total number of birds. So I wanted to go ahead and standardize that data and take a look at the actual patterns. So by dividing those two numbers and standardizing that, I should be able to see a true trend in bird numbers, right? In raptor population numbers. But what I'm seeing is a really similar graph to the RPIs that we're getting. So around 2010, 2009, we're getting this really nice decline. And then around 2016, it's starting to pick back up. And I was just, for the life of me, wanting to understand why we were having that decline. And I think I, and along with other people, have kind of figured it out. And it really comes down to the time of day. So if you take a look at the daily data from that period of time and, from the last decade, we can see that the day at Dinosaur Ridge was ended anywhere between noon and about 2:30 most days, which is a problem in the fact that when we had our biggest day this last year in 2022, over 57% of the birds that we had counted that day were after noon. So regardless of the number of hours that we're putting in, it sounds like we may have been missing birds. And that really is going to account for that weird dip in our data. And just some of the funky things going on with our birds and the population species and the raptor population indexes that we're seeing. And then another theory as to why we're seeing some weird figures is the standardization of counters. So like I said, having so many different organizations in charge and training people different ways and, just all of the aspects that come into having so many different people hands-on with one set of data, it can really get muddy, unfortunately. It's, just a higher likelihood of differences between the ways that people are counting or the ways that people are scanning. It comes with any sort of high volume data that you're trying to obtain. And so, what's the solution to that? And it's exactly what we've been doing and what Denver Field Ornithologist has been doing, by hiring a full-time counter, being able to standardize that, the methods in counting and just the people that are counting and the way that it's taught. That really is going to help kind of, cover that, what is the word I'm looking for? Sorry. Just cover the ambiguity in between counters between people, and then extending the season. So extending, counting past 12 or 2:30. This season we counted until 5 or 5:30. This upcoming season we're going to be counting until 5:30. And then also this upcoming season we're going to be extending it a week. So I believe this past season we counted until May 7th. And this season, we're going to be counting until May 14th. So, just kind of really overarching that season and making sure we're counting everything. So that is a little bit of kind of the issues and the challenges that Dinosaur Ridge has faced in the past. And then, like I said, I don't really like dwelling on the negative. So I wanted to throw in some really exciting things that happened this year. So I first wanted to start with what I have on the right side of the screen. This spring, we got a letter from Hawk Migration Association of North America explaining to us why it's so critical that Dinosaur Ridge stays in existence, continues being manned, continues being funded, and continues the work that it's doing. And one of those reasons that they explained to us of why they really would like us to see continue is only a few sites in the continent and in the world are counting prairie falcons as well as ferruginous hawks. And we are one of 2 count sites that operate in the spring on this flyway. There is one site, the Bridger Mountains in the spring, that counts. But they are 700 miles away from us, and both ferruginous hawks and prairie falcons are going to be nesting super heavily in Wyoming. Their population densities in Wyoming alone are really high. So the differences between the birds that we're counting at Dinosaur Ridge and the birds that are getting counted at Bridger Mountain is huge. And so Dinosaur Ridge really is a special little place. We've got we hold the record for ferruginous hawks in a day as well as in a season anywhere in the world. And we've, really destroyed some records this season, which I'll get into in a second. I personally think the Dinosaur Ridge is just an incredible spot. And it really is so unique in, Western hawkwatch sites are already few and far between. Spring sites are really rare. Like I said earlier, Hawkwatch International operates about 7 fall sites and 1 spring site. So having that data is really crucial. And I feel like we're really lucky, and I feel really lucky to be able to contribute to that. So I wanted to go ahead and enter and show you guys a little bit of that letter, because I think it's really sweet and really important, and just really nice to be reminded of why we're doing the work that we're doing, and seeing that, our mom and pop partner organization is recognizing us for what we're doing, and kind of explaining why they appreciate us, which is always great to hear. And then get into the fun stuff. So this year, spring 2022, was an absolutely incredible year, and that could definitely be attributed to having higher numbers of people up at the site. But I also just think it was an incredible year. So I wanted to kind of go over some of those records that we beat this year. So the first ones, like Dave said in the beginning, ferruginous hawks are really near and dear to my heart. So I'm going to start it off with the ferruginous hawks. We had a daily record this season of 21 birds in a day. The only other higher day on record is in 1997, when 40 were counted in a day. And then this season, we had a record high of 63. Same thing, we haven't had that high of a season of ferruginous hawks since 1997. And like I said, if you remember, Jerry Liguori counted 1997. So he holds those records. Not that they're attached to any one person, but I just think it's pretty neat that someone so monumental in the hawk watching field was there to count our records for us. I think it's fantastic. So that's the ferruginous hawks. The next record that we got to beat this year was the Merlin. We had 17 Merlins counted this season. It's a record high for Dinosaur Ridge. Next record high we had was 54 Swainson's hawks in a season. That was fantastic. And then we had another record high for the season of 513 turkey vultures. And I didn't really include too many RPIs or trend populations for the turkey vultures. But those guys are also doing really well across the continent. And it's always great to see that validated in your numbers. And then the next, we had 2 more records that we broke this year. We had the biggest day on record, 254 birds in a day. And Janet Peters managed to pick our Raptorthon as that day. So not only did we have the highest day in Dinosaur Ridge history, but it was on a Raptorthon, which was a fundraising event for us. So great job, Janet, for that call. And then the next and final record that we smashed this season was the biggest season since 2005. And I really do think that it could be any number of reasons, but I really am of the belief that having the having a full-time counter and having someone up there and just increasing the manpower and increasing the hours that you're up there really is going to provide these kind of results for us clearly. So before I ended things, I just wanted to go ahead and kind of present some of those resources that I have mentioned throughout this presentation. The first one being hawkcount.org. So if you came up to the site at all this spring and talked to me about our data, I put in that data every day at the end of the day, and that is where every other Hawkwatch site, or most other Hawkwatch sites, are going to be entering their data. So you can go onto that website and see to the day what birds have been counted where, and then you can also draw up those raptor population index graphs that I was showing earlier. So I think that's really neat. Being able to kind of have all of that data tied together and accessible is fantastic. The next resource that I kind of wanted to share with everyone was the Humana website. So it's hmana.org. And they put out a publishment of hawk migration studies. I think it's quarterly. So that's also a great resource to kind of get updated on the status of raptor populations. The next is the RPI project. I mentioned them a lot. So rpiproject.org, that's where you can also find those RPIs, the trend species that I was looking at. So that 20-year versus the 10-year graphs that I presented. And then they also have qualitative write-ups of species assessments. So, you can look at this data and you wonder why these birds are, either increasing or decreasing in populations. And they give you as much information as they have or that they can to explain that. And then the last one, I didn't really mention this one too much, but I did just want to mention it, is the Raptor Research Foundation. They provide and publish the Journal of Raptor Research. And that is a publication, a scientific publication with all sorts of raptor research. So not just migration, but it has some really incredible publications and just the highest and most up-to-date piece of research for raptor biologists. And then, being a good presenter, I just wanted to add my sources on there. And then, I just wanted to thank everyone so much for sticking it out with me. Big thanks to Carol and Jeff Burek for help with the history. A lot of this history, like I mentioned, is pretty hard to track down. So they helped kind of fill those, fill the blanks in for me. And then big thanks to Sharon, Susan, Bill, and Dave for having me. And thanks to all of you for listening to me talk about one of my favorite topics. And then I did want to mention, Dave, like Dave said, I have accepted the 2023 position of Hawk Counter for Dinosaur Ridge, which I could not be more elated about. And I will be there March 1st to May 14th, Wednesday through Sunday. And I really hope that if you weren't able to come out this spring, you're able to come out this spring. And if you were able to come out this past spring, I look forward to seeing you all again. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Emma, for a most interesting presentation and survey of giving us the history of Hawkwatch nationally and all the efforts that you and others have been doing up there on Dinosaur Ridge. Your enthusiasm is infectious, and I might mention that the Hawkwatch, the results that we're getting now are a result of having a paid counter, you specifically, so that a lot of that, and you mentioned that in your data, that the differences in protocol may have an effect on the counts that you're reporting. So thank you so much for all that you're doing, and we're pleased that you're going to be doing it again this year. And also thank you very much to Dave and to Carol, Janet Peters, for all you've done in furthering the cause of Hawkwatch. I might mention that if anyone would like to financially support Hawkwatch, you can do so by donating via the dfobirds.org website. There's a provision there where you can make a donation to help to support financially the efforts that are going on in Dinosaur Ridge. So, and it seems like the costs go up each time as we're providing more services for Emma and also the volunteers as well. So if any of you would like to do that, you're perfectly welcome to show your support financially through our dfobirds.org website. So, and Dave, would you like to say anything more about how people can get involved as volunteering for Hawkwatch?
Oh, you bet.
Dave's probably muted, maybe.
After the new year, we will
Okay.
be, after the new year, we'll be recruiting volunteers for Hawkwatch for 2023. And so we will make a big push on it. There will be at the end of February, we'll have a volunteer Zoom meeting and an outing at Dinosaur Ridge. So we'll just hold off to then, but we welcome all volunteers, and it's made Dinosaur Ridge into a big success this past year. And I hope those who participated last year will continue, and I hope to see many, many more. We are so thankful for your generosity and support. I also want to thank the board at this time for their generous support, and it's just been a big help. Thank you.
Okay, we've had some questions. One, Emma, is do hawks migrate alone or in flocks?
Yeah, I was just looking at the questions. I actually typed out 2 answers already because I didn't want to interrupt, but I will totally repeat them for y'all. But that is such a good question. So, it really varies between species. So most hawks are going to be migrating alone. In the West, we do tend to see some species migrating together. Those species would be turkey vultures, Swainson's hawks, and broad-winged hawks. Now, in the West, we don't really have the population numbers to see massive kettles of broad-winged hawks. When you're talking about raptors migrating together, the term used is kettle. So that's the term used for the group itself, and it's also used to describe the action that hawks will do when they circle up on those thermals, or the rising wind that I was kind of mentioning earlier. But yeah, so it's species specific. In the East, we see huge numbers, huge kettles of broad-winged hawks. And that is totally going to be, huge proportion of the volume that they get out there. So like I said earlier, the East sites get really great numbers. And a lot of those, a majority of them are going to be those broad-winged hawks. But then, yeah, in the West, I have seen kettles of turkey vultures as well as Swainson's hawks. And then this spring, actually, we had a couple small kettles, maybe 5, of red-tailed hawks too. So that was really interesting. But most of them are going to be migrating alone.
Okay. And then another comment, 2005 forward to recent years decline at Dinosaur Ridge might be due to a decline, especially between the years 2015 and 2001 of observers and changes in organization. Yeah, and you've commented on that one.
Totally, yeah, and thank you, Mike, for that. That's kind of the information that I was missing. Like I said, I've only been around here for a couple years, so getting a better idea of that history is always nice.
And this one may not necessarily pertain to Hawkwatch, but what's your favorite birding trail?
That is such a good question. So I really like the DIA birding driving loop. I tend to do a little bit more of car birding than hiking and birding, or just kind of walking a birding trail, because I'm usually looking for raptors, and it's usually a lot easier to find them if you're covering a little bit more ground. But the DIA loop I really like. In the summer, you can find burrowing owls, ferruginous hawks, a lot of those kind of other plain species. Plenty of the meadowlarks, horned larks, all those kind of guys. And then I also really like going out to Pawnee, and Pawnee has a number of different kind of routes that have already been drawn up. Yeah, those are my 2 favorite.
Okay.
And then, yeah, Mike, I'm seeing your comment. Thank you so much. It really has been such a privilege and an honor to be able to work with you guys. I really do mean it when I say that I love Dinosaur Ridge, and I love working with Denver field ornithologists. Working as a biologist can be tough sometimes, but you guys really are just a pleasure to work with. And I could not be more honored that you asked me to speak tonight. So thank you guys.